All right, you guys, this will be the last video lecture of the semester we are doing because this is our last unit and it's producing the television newscast. If you may recall, before we broke for spring break and midterms, we had producing the radio newscast. So now we're going to do the same thing on the television side. This will be the last unit we have, and then next week on Tuesday, so the 28th, I will post a video review of the final exam study guide. Now remember, the final exam will have just questions over this unit we're doing right now, chapter 14, plus questions that you have already answered on the quiz that you did last week. And I'll get those corrected quizzes back to you this week so that you can have them to study for the final exam. So producing the television newscast. So what is a producer? Well, basically, the producer is the boss. The producer is the person who is in charge of the newscast. They're the ones who decide what goes on air. They're the ones who decide what stories are covered, in what order, whether the stories are packages or readers. They are really kind of the people in charge. So formally, a producer frames the entire newscast and acts as the gatekeeper. And a gatekeeper is the person who allows or denies a story getting on the air. Oftentimes, producers will work in partnership with an assignment editor who helps the reporters, who helps decide which reporters cover what stories. But most newsrooms have a morning show producer that does the morning news, and then they have a producer that is in charge of the evening news, so the 5 and 6 o'clock newscast, and then they have a nighttime reporter who is in charge of the 10 o'clock newscast. In a bigger newsroom where they have even more newscasts, you might have one producer who's in charge of the 5 o'clock and another one who's in charge of the 6 o'clock. It just really depends on how big the newsroom is. But producers will lay out the newscast. They'll decide what story will lead, and they also decide how stories will stack and flow. And by stack, I mean what order they go in. So they pick the lead story. Obviously, that's the most important story, but then they decide what follows the lead story. And you might think that the lead story is the most important story, so the next story should be the second most important story. But it might not be. It might be a reader that's just a few lines, but it somehow goes with the first story. So say your first story is, about the stay-at-home orders with COVID-19. A second story that might follow up on that is just what's the latest death toll in the area from COVID-19. Producers decide story formats. So they decide what story is a package, what story is a reader, what story is a VO, and they decide whether or not they're going to use videos, pictures, or graphics with each story. Another job is, since producers are kind of in charge, they have to juggle different schedules, also egos and personalities. There are lots of reporters competing for airtime, and one reporter might be like, I want to do a package so that I can get a stand-up in, and I can get my face out there. And the producer might have to be the person that says, sorry, no, that's going to be just a reader. Or there may be someone who worked really hard on a story and wants to have a package, and for some reason, they ran out of time and they have to cut that story altogether. So the producer has to make those tough calls. And they also have to juggle schedules, so make sure that the reporters have enough time to cover their stories and get to different stories. They have to decide who they're going to call in, if there's a breaking story, that sort of thing. And they have basically 30 minutes to get their job done. They have 30 minutes in the newscast. However, immediately you're going to take away 8 minutes for commercials, so you're down to 22 minutes. And then you need to dedicate 3 minutes for weather, 4 minutes for sports, 1 minute for bumps, opens and closes, and that leaves you with really 14 minutes of news. That's your news hole. 14 minutes is where you have room for news. So you have to get all the stories of the day to your audience in 14 minutes. There are different types of producers. The main producer, the one who's kind of high up and in charge of everyone, is the executive producer. And then you usually have a line or show producer. And the line or show producer is the one who's really hands-on with each show. Like I said, you might have a producer who's in charge of the 5 or 6 o'clock news. That's the show producer. In bigger newsrooms, you'll also have basically assistants to the show producers, which are the associate producers. And then you might also have a field producer or a web producer, but again, those are usually just in larger markets. So let's go through each one of these types of producers. The executive producer is kind of responsible more for the station itself and the long-term look of the newscast. They don't really work on individual daily newscasts. That's kind of below their pay grade. They're more in charge of the tone of the news station and the image of the news station. So they're kind of like almost PR. But they'll decide on things like, what does the set look like? Who are the anchors going to be? They'll work, with the news director and the general manager on selecting anchors. They'll help design the opens and closes that play at the beginning and ends of newscasts. And they'll also guide the news philosophy, which is just a general ideology of the newsroom and what they cover and what they decide not to cover. And they're kind of in charge of making sure that the station follows the ethical guidelines that the company has set forth. But with that responsibility, they're also responsible for ratings. They have to make sure the ratings stay high. And if any mistakes are made, they come back to bite the executive producer in the butt. So it might be, a show producer who is responsible for an error that was made in the 5 o'clock news, but that's going to reflect poorly on the executive producer as well. And the executive producer is very high up and usually reports directly to the news director. So the news director and the executive producer work kind of hand in hand as management. Then you have your line or show producer. So that person decides daily what goes into the broadcast and then also make sure that the show is ready to go on the air at the exact time it needs to go on the air. And then one of their most important jobs is they prepare what's called the rundown, or sometimes it's also called a lineup. And this is basically an outline, and it shows which packages, readers, and voiceovers will go into the show, how much time each story gets, and the order of the stories. So obviously, you would lead with your most important story, and generally that's going to be a package, unless it's something that's just breaking, you didn't have time to put a package together, which can sometimes happen. But they prepare the rundown, and that's what I really want you to pay attention to in this lecture, because that's going to be something you're going to be working on. They update the rundown daily based on breaking news events and other issues. So they might say, okay, well, the lead story today is going to be COVID-19. But then, somebody decides to go and shoot up a church and kill 10 people. And you're like, okay, well, we've got a new lead story. So who's going to go cover that story? And what are we going to bump? And what are we going to cut to make room for it in the newscast? They work closely with assignment editors and reporters. So the assignment editor is usually the person who tells the reporter which story they're going to work on. In some smaller stations, the show producer might kind of also be the assignment editor. But basically, they're going to work closely with the reporters and tell them, yes, you're going to cover this story, and yes, it's going to be a package, or you have to be in this location at this time to interview this person. And they'll work with the other line producers at the station to ensure their newscasts aren't repetitive. So let's say you have a show producer for the 5 o'clock news, and then you have a show producer for the 6 o'clock news. Those two have to work together to make sure they're not having the exact same newscast airing at 5 and at 6. They have to change the order of their stories, maybe add some new stories, take some stories out, reformat it. They have to make sure that they're not just really repetitive. So associate producer is basically an assistant to the line producer. Again, this is usually going to only be in large news departments. If you're working at a station, in the size of Jefferson City, you're going to be doing all these jobs. Associate producers are kind of more hands-on. They do some of the grunt work. They may finish a story for a reporter. If a reporter gets called out to a breaking story, they might finish, cutting soundbite or cutting video or editing a video together. They may write some of the scripts or produce some of the voiceovers or voiceover sound on tapes. Again, if it's something that doesn't require a stand-up, they can slice those together and actually read the voiceover part. They'll monitor the satellite feed and wires. So they're monitoring what's going on nationwide, and if anything big is going to break nationally that needs to be covered in the news, they're going to make sure they're on top of that information. And they also will help coordinate feeds from reporters in the field. So they'll say, okay, I know Sally is covering the shooting at the church, and she has the live truck at the church, and so I've got to make sure that Sally calls in her report and we're able to hear her and she's able to hear us, and we know what she's going to be talking about. A field producer is also known as an advanced person or a facilitator. Again, this is going to usually only be found in large newsrooms. They kind of help with field work, basically. They help reporters research and stories and find out details about stories. They might set up an interview for a reporter. So you might come in, if you're a reporter, to the newsroom the next day, and the field producer already has your interviews all lined up and just tells you when and where to be. They'll tell you who you're going to interview. They'll give you some background information on the interviewee and the topic. They may go along with a reporter to a live shoot and find people at the scene of a story that the reporter can interview. And they might actually direct the videographer to get certain shots. And they'll also make travel arrangements. They may speak with interviewees and newsmakers ahead of events and may help reporters with questions. So if if they know that they're going to be doing a story in 2 weeks about, a sales tax proposal, they may set up the interview, quite a bit in advance, knowing that they're going to cover this story at that time, and they'll go ahead and call and make the arrangements and actually have some idea of questions that they want the reporter to ask. The web producer, this is being seen more and more now as more and more stations have social media platforms and web sites. But the web producer is constantly updating the station's website and monitoring social media platforms. So they're monitoring, Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all those things. And you'll see a lot of times if you're reading, something on Facebook, they'll say, a comment has been disabled for violating our policy. Basically, that person has to read through all the comments, and if anyone is being a troll or being offensive or saying something that violates the rules, the web producer has to be on top of it and make sure that is taken down. So that's kind of a thankless job that I would never want. And they also have to be really fast. They have to be on top of stories. They want to be the first one to break a story. They want to be the first website that has that story up. So accuracy is still important, but speed is also important. Okay, so what kind of skills do you need to be a producer? You need good writing skills. Often if you're a producer, you're going to write some copy for the headlines that the anchors read at the beginning of the news. They'll write teases, they'll write bumps and transitions. They also have to be able to rewrite a story on the fly and trim a story. So let's say, it's 5:50 and a story comes through the wire that you have to have on at the 6 o'clock news. You don't have time to track down a reporter and have the reporter write the story and turn it in and to be reviewed. No, you're the producer. You got to rewrite that story within the next 10 minutes and get it loaded into the teleprompter. Also, if you're going along in the newscast and you realize, shoot, we're about 2 minutes long, you have to figure out what you're going to trim from where. And so you're really providing the voice of the newscast. You set the tone for how the news is going to sound. Your day will usually start with a staff meeting. Oftentimes, staff meetings are held 3 times a day, in the morning, in the afternoon, and after the first evening newscast. So the producer and the reporters and the assignment editor and the news director will all get in a room at the beginning of the day, and that's where they decide what stories they're going to cover, who's going to cover them, whether they're going to be packages, VOs, VOSOTs, and it's where they produce the rundown. During meetings, stories may be rearranged or changed. So they'll have that morning meeting, but then, let's say something happened between morning and afternoon. There was a breaking news story, or one story ran long, or someone's got an interview they really want to include in what was supposed to be a reader. Those are when changes are going to be made. And then after the first newscast of the day, after the 5 o'clock news, there's an evening meeting where the producers discuss with the anchors and the reporters what went right, what went wrong, what other stations did, what stories did they cover that we didn't cover, and then they plan the late night newscast, the 10 o'clock news. Meetings are where ideas are discussed and everyone should participate. So whether you are a producer or a reporter, you're expected to bring ideas to the table. If it's a slow news day, they're going to go to you and be like, what do you think? What should we cover? When I was an intern at Channel 17, I would sit in on staff meetings, and even though I was just an intern, I would be expected to pitch story ideas. So in these staff meetings, that's again where the rundown is created and stories are assigned to reporters. The rundown is basically a blueprint of what stories will appear in the newscast, who reads them, how long they last, what type of story it is, and what order the stories go in. And the rundown is a living document that changes throughout the day. The rundown can change at any time because not all news is planned and not all news is going to fit into your perfect little schedule that you came up with at 8 a.m. and it's now 2 p.m. So you have to be prepared to change that rundown. It's kind of hard to see here, so you'll just want to, look at it as you're looking through the PowerPoint. But on slide 12 and slide 13, I've got examples of rundowns. Slide 12 is kind of a simple, basic rundown. It looks like it's a college rundown, so it's kind of, pared down. It's not as full as this other one. This one's a lot more detailed. It has all the teases and the breaks in it, whereas this one just kind of has stories in it. But there are some things that every rundown has. It has a number. And a number is where the story appears in the newscast. So if it's got a number 1 by it, that's the first story of the newscast. And sometimes, since the rundown is a living document that changes, it's not necessarily the first story that's on the first line. It could be that originally the story that was on the top line was going to be the lead story. Oh, but now it's bumped to number 3 because we had something else happen. STAT stands for status. That is whether the story has been approved for air. So again, that's something that's going to be changed throughout the day. The status will probably be in working for most of the day until it gets close to being approved for air. And the producer is the one who has the final approval for whether a story is ready for air. They may look at a story that the reporter has submitted and be like, no, recut it. The rundown should have the slug, which is the short title of every story. You guys have written a lot of slugs, so you know what those are. It has the format written with it. Is it a reader? Is it a VO? Is it a VOSOT? Is it a package? Talent, that means which anchor reads the story. Not necessarily which reporter is covering the story, although that would be on there as well, but also if it's a reader, for instance, which anchor is going to read it. And you do have to figure that out ahead of time because anchors can sometimes compete for stories and, they might want to make sure that their face is getting as much airtime as their co-anchor's face. Cam, which camera is used for a shot. Usually each anchor will have their own dedicated camera and then there'll be a wide shot. GPX is if graphics are needed for the story. ERT, estimated runtime. SOT gives lengths of pre-produced sound on tape pieces. So, if you have a package or a VO SOT, you want to know how long that SOT is. And that's something that you can figure out before you go live. And then Cum is the cumulative runtime. So that's taking everything in the newscast and figuring out in certain places, certain lines, what are you at time-wise? Okay, so your first block of news is going to put you at 8 minutes, and then you have 3 minutes for commercials, and then your second block of news is 7 minutes, and so on and so on. And you just kind of keep a cumulative running time of where you're at. So leads, clusters, and kickers. So we're going to talk about leads, clusters, and clickers and where they go in blocks. So newscasts are divided usually in 4 blocks. A, B, C, and D blocks, and each block is separated by a commercial break. So if any of you guys are in my 336 class, you guys are familiar with this. We always had, figuring out what our first few stories were going to be, and then we took a break, then we came back and figured out what the next group of stories were going to be, and then we took another break, and that's how it's done in the real newscast. So the A block is you have your bump, you have your anchor intros, and then you have your lead story. The lead story of the day obviously goes in the A block, and then the A block typically is your harder news and your more important news. Now, there's a couple different ways you can go about it, and we're going to talk about those. But there are some people who are old school and believe in the inverted pyramid. That means the most important stuff goes on the top, and then it just gets less and less important as you go through the newscast so that you can trim directly from the bottom if you have to, if you're running out of time. Nowadays, we have more of what's called a valley and peak format of a newscast, where you put some important stories in your A block. Obviously, your lead story goes in your A block. But if you have a really good story that the audience is really going to want to pay attention to, you might save that for the B block so that you can make sure that the audience stays with the newscast and doesn't just tune out after the A block. And how do you get the audience to stick around for the B block? Well, you tease the B block. Before you take that commercial break, you tease what's coming up in the B block. Why should the audience stay tuned? So you have your A block, and then you go to commercial. You come back for the B block. Generally, you have your lighter news here. Beat updates. That's where you ask your beat reporters, what do you have? You have a story for us. You might say, you might have a health reporter. You might have a school reporter. You might have a local government reporter. You may have a economy reporter. You ask them, what have you been working on? Do you have any stories that need to go into the newscast? And then they tease what's coming up in the C block. C block is always sports. And oftentimes, if you're a producer, you don't have to worry too much about the C block because generally the sports anchor has a team and they put the whole C block together. They don't really need a whole lot of input from the producer. The only thing is the producer has to give them a time and they know, okay, we need to fill this time. And they might go to the producer if they need more time or if they don't have enough to fill the time. But basically the producer doesn't do much for the C block except for carve out the time for them. So you go to sports. Oh, I'm sorry. And in the B block, also at the end of the B block is weather. And weather is very important because most people will listen to a newscast just for weather. Then you have the C block of sports. D block, that's going to be where you have your entertainment stories, your feature stories, and your feel-good stories. Generally, you want to end your newscast kind of in an upbeat fashion because no one wants to have a really depressing story. And then that's it for tonight. Good night, folks. Now, make sure you stay tuned for Wheel of Fortune. So you want to kind of end on an upbeat note. So leads, clicks, and clusters, or leads, clusters, and kickers. Leads go in your A block. Then your remaining stories are clustered into what's left of the A block and the B block. So your lead goes in the A block, and then your other stories are clustered in A and B. And then your kickers come at the end in the B block. A kicker is basically the last story of the newscast and is generally called a kicker because it's supposed to be like a feel-good story, where you kick up your feet. The D block has kickers because, one, you don't want to end on a downer, but two, they can also easily be dropped. If you're running out of time and you don't have time to put that feel-good story in there, just cut it, okay? Okay, so here's where we're talking about that format. Peak and valley versus inverted pyramid. So the peak and valley format, basically it treats every block as its own mini newscast that can stand on its own. So let's say the A block is 6 minutes long. You would want to be able to take that 6 minutes and put that on YouTube and have people tune in and watch it, or watch it on FaceTime, or put it on any web sharing format that you want. And it's a little mini newscast. Now, what that means is you have to have a lead story in every block. So you do have to have an important story in the B block because you want to give people a reason to come, back and stay for the B block. So it's not just the inverted pyramid. The inverted pyramid says, you put your most important story first, and then each story below it is descending in importance. The peak and valley format is more like there's an ebb and flow that goes up and it goes down. The peaks are your strong stories, your lead stories, but you should have some of them in A block and some of them in B block. You don't really put a strong story in D block, but you can put an interesting story, a human interest story in D block. So your peaks are your strong stories, and then your valleys are the less important stories and the commercial. Also, for some people, sports is a peak. For some people, don't care about sports at all. But for everyone, weather is a peak. Everyone cares about the weather. So the idea is that each block, A block, B block, C block, and D block, starts with a good, strong story. There's some less important stories included. So you have a peak and a valley. And maybe you throw in a feature or a special report. Maybe your health reporter has a story on, obesity. And so you might throw that in there, especially if they have, really interesting video or something to go along with it. Each block must end with a strong story and a strong tease before a commercial break. So again, at the end of the A block, you got to tease that B block and let the audience know that, hey, you need to stay tuned because we got a really great story coming up that you're going to watch. And the theory behind this is if you sprinkle your most important, interesting stories throughout the newscast, you'll keep the audience hooked to the end. So remember, it's basically the opposite of that inverted pyramid format that says most important, then less important, less important, less important, all the way down to least important. Again, always tease the weather because it's why most people watch the news. So your weather comes at the end of the B block. So at the end of A block, you say, make sure you stay tuned for this story and for weather. And then at the top of the B block, you say, we'll have weather in just a few minutes, but before we get to weather, here's these stories. Rhythm and flow. So this is, you have to decide how your newscast is going to move, how it's going to flow. What format you decide to use the stories is really important. Most viewers like packages. Packages appeal to viewers because you get to see the reporter do a stand-up, and you get to see interesting video, and you get to see sound bites. If you had someone who you knew was going to be on the news, they'd be like, hey, make sure you watch the 6 o'clock news. I'm going to be on there talking to the reporters about the park, But packages, sometimes it can be boring if you have a newscast and it's just package after package after package after package. You have to strategically place those packages and then break up the rhythm by throwing in some readers and throwing in some VOs. It'd be really boring if it was all package, 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 VO, SOT, VO, SOT, VO, VO, and then reader, reader. And that would get really predictable too. So you don't want to do that. You want to sprinkle different types of stories throughout the newscast. Also, if you have a package, again, it's pre-recorded, so the anchors are reading along and they say, okay, now we're going to go to Stephen who has a story. And then it goes to the package. It's already on tape, and it gives the anchors time to reset, to regroup, to restack their papers, to figure out the pronunciation of a difficult name. And also, this is when the producers are going to talk in their earpieces and be like, hey, great job, guys. We're running on time. Or, hey, guys, we need you to fill about a minute with banter. Or, hey, guys, we're running out of time, so we're going to drop this next story. It basically gives the anchors a little 2-minute break while your pre-produced story is running. But be wary as an anchor and prepared for computer technical problems, because you might think, okay, now Steven's package is going to play, and then, oops, all of a sudden it's not playing for some reason, or it's playing and it doesn't have sound. And so we're going to go back to the anchors, and the anchors have to be able to say, okay, we'll come back to that story in a minute, and then they have to be prepared to move on and cover for what's happening. You guys are probably too young to remember this, but we used to have these things called VCRs, and VCRs played something called tapes. And sometimes, tapes actually had tape inside them, and sometimes the tape would come unwound, and the VCR would eat the tape, and all the tape would spill out of the little cassette that it was in, and it would, you would say the VCR ate the tape, and then you couldn't play the tape until, you wound it back up and fixed it. And obviously, if we had a package on tape, because packages used to be on tape, back when I started in this business, the VCR could eat the package and be like, okay, well, we don't have that package anymore. So we don't really do tape anymore, but it can still happen with computers. Computers can crash, files can become corrupted. So just because we have new technology, it doesn't mean that we aren't still going to have problems that we need to be careful of. Okay, so we're about 30 minutes in, so I'm going to take a quick break right here because, these videos can't be too long if I'm going to load them to YouTube. And then we'll pick up with the second half of the lecture right after this.